The Allies did not lose men at Arnhem because the Germans were stronger. They lost them because the wrong general was given everything. In September 1944, Winston Churchill believed the war was finally about to end, until one set of numbers forced him to confront a disturbing paradox. While Montgomery faltered after receiving absolute priority, unlimited fuel, and elite airborne forces, George Patton, operating with half the resources, was tearing through German territory. In the same 9 days that Market Garden collapsed in Holland, Patton took 12 cities, crossed multiple rivers, captured tens of thousands of prisoners, and pushed closer to Germany than anyone thought possible. Churchill was forced to face a truth few leaders ever admit in wartime. The problem was not the plan, not the enemy, and not a lack of resources, but a misplaced faith in the man chosen to lead. What followed was not just anger, but a reckoning that nearly fractured Allied command and permanently changed how the war would be fought. If you want to understand how one decision inside Allied command nearly changed the course of the war, stay with me, because what Churchill discovered next forced a reckoning no one was prepared for. By September 1944, victory no longer felt abstract to the Allied leadership. It felt close, tangible, almost inevitable. Paris had been liberated. German forces were retreating across France in disarray. Every week brought new headlines of cities falling, prisoners captured, and shattered German divisions scrambling east. For the first time since 1939, Allied commanders were no longer asking whether Germany could be defeated, but how fast it could be finished. Inside London, that optimism hardened into belief. Winston Churchill, exhausted by 5 years of war, was searching for a decisive blow, not another grind. A single operation that could break Germany's back and end the war before 1945 ever arrived. Britain needed that ending, politically, economically, psychologically, and one man promised exactly that. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had spent months everywhere, but by concentrating everything, one thrust, one decisive blow, a narrow front supplied with absolute priority. Driving straight into the heart of Germany, it was bold, it was elegant, and it appealed deeply to Churchill's instincts. Montgomery spoke with certainty. He always did. He projected controlled its contingencies. Montgomery spoke in assurances. The Germans were exhausted. Their reserves were depleted. Their defenses in the north were weak. If the Allies moved fast enough, the Rhine could be crossed before the Germans understood what was happening. It was, Montgomery insisted, the opportunity of a lifetime. Churchill listened, and more importantly, he believed this belief mattered, because belief is what turns plans into policy. Once Churchill accepted Montgomery's vision, the machinery of Allied logistics began to move in only one direction. Fuel, trucks, air support, airborne divisions, everything that could be spared was pushed north. Operation Market Garden was born from that faith. The scale of the commitment was unprecedented. British, American, and Polish paratroopers dropped deep behind enemy lines. Armored columns would race up a single narrow highway to relieve them. Bridges would fall in sequence. The Rhine would be crossed. Germany's industrial heartland would be exposed. It was not just a military plan. It was a promise. And above all, he promised results. To make that promise possible, Montgomery demanded absolute priority, and he received it. While other Allied commanders waited for fuel, Market Garden was fed relentlessly. Every ton of gasoline mattered, and nearly all of it went to Montgomery's 21st Army Group. If this operation succeeded, the war would end. Every sacrifice elsewhere would be justified. Churchill approved it. Eisenhower approved it. The Allied command structure aligned behind it, and that alignment came at a cost 200 miles to the south. Another army was advancing. Not with speeches. General George Patton's Third Army had been pushing east through Lorraine, fighting its way across rivers and fortified towns. The Germans there were not collapsing. They were resisting, counterattacking, and retreating only when forced to. Patton's problem was not the enemy. It was fuel. For weeks his advance had slowed, not because German defenses held, but because his tanks ran dry. Patton complained bitterly, openly accusing Allied headquarters of starving his army to feed Montgomery's gamble. His warnings were noted, then ignored. This was the trade-off Churchill had accepted. Market Garden would get everything. The assumption was that Montgomery's operation represented the main effort, while Patton's advance was secondary. Useful but not decisive, aggressive but strategically less important. The real prize lay in the north, beyond the Dutch rivers. Across the Rhine, that assumption was shared by nearly everyone who mattered. El Alamein had made him a hero in Britain. He was careful, methodical. He prepared thoroughly and avoided unnecessary risk. In a war defined by disasters and retreats, Montgomery's style felt reassuring. Patton, by contrast, made many uncomfortable. He moved fast. He spoke recklessly. He thrived amid worried politicians, but his temperament worried. Giving him unlimited resources felt dangerous. Giving Montgomery control felt safe. So Churchill chose safety over speed. Market Garden began on September 17, 1944, under clear skies and enormous expectations. For a moment it seemed Montgomery had been right. Initial landings succeeded. Bridges were taken. But within days, cracks began to appear. Resistance was heavier than expected. German units that intelligence believed were absent were very much present. Veteran SS Panzer divisions, refitting near Arnhem, reacted faster than anyone had. Bottleneck. Priority remained absolute. Churchill in London waited for confirmation that the gamble had paid off. Instead, silence began to stretch. Reports became vague. Progress slowed. And then, finally, the numbers sat back. They did not describe a temporary setback. They described catastrophe. The final bridge. The bridge that mattered. Still in German hands, at that same moment, far from the Dutch rivers, Patton's army was still moving, with half the fuel, no priority, and constant logistical pressure. Third Army was advancing, city by city, river by river. German units were not withdrawing voluntarily. They were being destroyed or captured. Tens of thousands of prisoners were already moving west. 2 operations, same war, same enemy, same week. Only one of them was delivering results. Churchill had not yet compared them side by side, but the foundation of that comparison had already been laid. The belief he had placed in Montgomery, the faith that had shaped Allied strategy, was about to collide with a reality no speech could explain away, and once that collision occurred, nothing about Allied command would remain the same. Operation Market Garden did not collapse in a single moment. It unraveled slowly, piece by piece, in a way that made it far more dangerous. At first, everything appeared to confirm Montgomery's confidence. The airborne landings on September 17th were largely successful. Paratroopers seized key objectives, secured several bridges. For a brief window, it looked as if the gamble had worked. That illusion did not last. The plan relied on a fragile chain of assumptions. Each assumption depended on the previous one holding perfectly. German resistance would be light. Armored units would advance rapidly along a single narrow highway. Airborne forces would hold bridges for just long enough to be relieved. Weather would cooperate. Communications would remain intact in war. Assumptions are debts, and Market Gardens accumulated too many at once. The first cracks appeared around the highway itself, a thin strip of elevated road cutting through flat, exposed terrain. British armor advancing north found itself forced into a single file, unable to maneuver, unable to bypass resistance. German units, far from disorganized, adapted quickly. Roadblocks appeared. Bridgery zeroed in on choke points. Every delay mattered. Every hour lost was an hour the airborne troops could not afford. The British 1st Airborne Division dropped farther from the bridge than planned due to concerns about flak. Immediately encountered resistance far heavier than intelligence had predicted. Radio communications faltered. Units became isolated. German counterattacks came not from scattered rear guards, but from experienced SS Panzer formation operating with discipline. Dutch resistance networks had reported German armor near Arnhem. Aerial reconnaissance had raised concerns. Intelligence officers had expressed doubts about the assumption that German forces in the area were weak. Each warning was acknowledged. Each was dismissed. Montgomery believed the opportunity outweighed the risk. When reports from the field contradicted the plan was not adjusted, the timetable remained unchanged. The highway remained the only axis of advance. The assumption that speed would compensate for friction remained unchallenged. Inside the Arnhem perimeter, British paratroopers fought with extraordinary courage. Cut off from resupply, short on ammunition, overwhelmed by armor and artillery, they continued to resist for days, but courage does not replace fuel, reinforcements, or flexibility. Relief forces never arrived in time. The ground advance slowed to a crawl. Each mile north was contested. German units exploited the narrow corridor mercilessly, cutting supply lines, forcing delays, and inflicting losses disproportionate to the terrain gained. Yet the flow of resources did not change. Fuel continued to be sent north at the same priority. Trucks were rerouted. Other sectors waited. The logic was still the same. By September 21st, it was clear that Arnhem was not going to fall. The British airborne forces had been reduced to isolated pockets. Medical supplies were exhausted. Casualties mounted. Attempts to reinforce them failed. Polish paratroopers dropped south of the river, unable to reach the trap units on the northern bank. This was the most dangerous phase of the failure. Not the initial miscalculation, but the refusal to adapt once reality made itself known. Montgomery had built his reputation on careful preparation and control. Market Garden demanded improvisation under pressure. It was not a skill he possessed. On September 25th, the survivors of the 1st Airborne Division were evacuated across the Rhine under cover of darkness. Of the more than 10,000 men who had landed near Arnhem, only a fraction returned. The bridge that had justified the entire operation remained firmly in German hands. Market Garden had failed in its primary objective. The cost was staggering: 10,000 Allied casualties. An elite airborne division effectively destroyed, 9 days of absolute must-sitting priority expended for a territorial gain that did not alter the strategic situation in any meaningful way. The failure was not total annihilation, but it was decisive enough to shatter the promise Montgomery had made. What made it worse was what happened elsewhere during those same 9 days. While Montgomery's forces stalled and bled along the Dutch corridor, the war in southern France did not pause. German units there did not vanish. They fought, retreated, regrouped, and counterattacked as ordered, and they were being beaten. Patton's Third Army, operating without priority, without speeches, and without indulgence from Allied headquarters, continued to advance. Towns fell, rivers were crossed, German devitured. This contrast did not exist in hindsight. It existed in real time. Reports flowed into Allied headquarters from both sectors. One described deny confusion, mounting catastrophes. One described The other described steady progress, seized terrain, and tens of thousands of prisoners. The difference was impossible to explain away, as luck. Market Garden had consumed everything Montgomery asked for. He had been given the best chance any commander could reasonably expect. When the plan failed, there was nowhere left to shift the blame without confronting uncomfortable questions. Why had intelligence warnings been ignored? Why had the plan depended so heavily on a single road? Why had the operation continued unchanged after its assumptions were clearly broken? And most dangerously of all, why had one general been trusted so completely that the entire Allied logistical system bent to his will? Montgomery's defenders would later argue that Market Garden died down German forces, prevented counteroffensives, and contributed indirectly to Allied success. Some truth in that, but those arguments came later. In late September 1944, none of that mattered. What mattered was that Churchill now faced a comparison he could no longer ignore. Two generals, two approaches, two outcomes. One had demanded absolute priority and delivered failure. The other had been constrained and delivered results. Montgomery had faltered not because he lacked courage or intelligence, but because his method could not survive friction. His style required conditions to be perfect when they were not. He had no answer except persistence. War rarely rewards persistence without adaptation. It punctured a belief that had guided Allied strategy since Normandy. The belief that the war could be ended by one brilliant stroke, executed by one carefully chosen commander. Churchill had embraced that belief. Now he was forced to confront its consequences. The failure at Arnhem was not just a battlefield setback. It was the moment when faith met evidence, and evidence refused to bend. And once Churchill began to compare that evidence with what was happening in Patton's sector, the political shockwave was inevitable. That reckoning was about to begin. While Market Garden was bleeding out in Holland, the war in the South followed a very different rhythm. There were no dramatic airborne landings, no promises of ending the war by Christmas, no speeches about decisive strokes. There was only movement. Constant, relentless movement. George Patton's Third Army did not pause when fuel was cut. When tanks could not move, infantry advanced. When bridges were destroyed, engineers rebuilt them under fire. When supplies ran thin, Patton shortened his lines, took the next town, and used captured German stockpiles to keep going. This was not improvisation born of desperation. Between September 17th and September 25th, while Montgomery's forces were locked into a single narrow corridor in the Netherlands, Third Army advanced across Lorraine as if the war had suddenly accelerated in their sector alone. Towns that German planners believed could be held for weeks fell in days. Nancy was the most important. The city was heavily defended, anchored by the Moselle River, and protected by fortified positions manned by experienced German units. Patton did not wait for perfect conditions. He crossed under fire, forced a bridgehead, and pressed forward before the Germans could stabilize their lines. Within days, Nancy was in Allied hands, and Patton did not stop. Then Château Salins, then Pont-à-Mousson. Each capture widened the breach. Each breach pulled German reserves away from other fronts. The German command was forced into a series of reactive moves, shifting units from one threatened sector to another, never regaining control of the tempo. This was the real advantage Patton created. Rivers that Montgomery's planners treated as major obstacles were treated by Patton as problems to be solved immediately. The Moselle was crossed, then the Meurthe, then the Mortagne. Each crossing was contested, each crossing was costly. German units did not evaporate. They fought, they counterattacked. Entire formations were shattered in place. By the end of that same 9-day period, Third Army had captured approximately 45,000 German prisoners, not stragglers, not broken remnants, organized units that had been forced to surrender because their positions were no longer tenable. This was not a secondary sector fighting a weakened enemy. This was a front collapsing under sustained pressure. Patton achieved this with half the fuel Montgomery had been given, no priority, no special allocations, no indulgence from Allied headquarters. His army moved because it had learned to move without permission. This fact alone made Market Garden indefensible. If Montgomery had failed against overwhelming German strength, Patton's success would have been irrelevant. If Patton had advanced against token resistance, his numbers could have been dismissed, but the scale of Third Army's results eliminated both explanation. Cities do not fall by accident. Tens of thousands of prisoners are not taken from an enemy that is already beaten. These were outcomes produced by command decisions. Patton did not wait for complete information. He acted on what he knew and adjusted when he was wrong. Where Montgomery relied on a plan to impose order on chaos, Patton accepted chaos as a condition of war and moved faster within it. The contrast could not have been sharper. Montgomery's operation demanded perfection. Patton's accepted imperfection and exploited it. Patton treated limited resources as a constraint to be worked around, not an excuse to stop. This difference mattered far beyond individual battles. Every city Patton took shortened the war in a way Market Garden never did. Each advance forced German commanders to commit reserves earlier than planned. German units pulled south to counter Patton were units that could not reinforce Arnhem. Patton's advance did not just succeed on its own terms. It exposed the strategic cost of Montgomery's failure. This was the realization beginning to form in Churchill's mind as reports crossed his desk. He did not need speeches. Fuel allocations, casualty figures, prisoner counts. maps showing advances measured in miles and cities captured. When those reports were placed side by side, the story they told was unmistakable. One army consumed enormous resources and produced delay. Why had Patton been constrained when he was clearly capable of exploiting success? Why had Montgomery been indulged even as his assumption collapsed? And most critically, why had Allied strategy been built around a man whose method failed the moment reality intruded? Patton never framed his actions as a challenge to Allied leadership. His results spoke loudly enough. When asked about his casualty, when asked about resistance, he described it as something to be crushed before it had time to organize. This attitude unsettled many in Allied headquarters, but by late September it was also becoming impossible to ignore. The war was revealing a truth that no amount of planning could obscure. Speed, aggression, and adaptability were deciding outcomes faster than elegance or theoretical perfection. Market Garden had promised a shortcut to victory. Patton delivered something far more dangerous to the existing command structure, proof that the shortcut was never necessary. The problem was not that Montgomery had failed once. It was that his failure had occurred at the exact moment another general demonstrated what success looked like under far harsher constraints. That juxtaposition transformed Patton's advance into more than a battlefield achievement. It became an indictment. Churchill had built his expectations around Montgomery. Now he was forced to reckon with a commander who had won, not because the system favored him, but in spite of it. By the end of September 1944, the question facing Allied leadership was no longer whether Market Garden had failed. That was undeniable. The real question was whether they were willing to accept what Patton's success implied. Because if Patton was right, then the war had been slowed not by German resistance but by Allied choices, and once that question was asked, it could not be unanswered. Winston Churchill did not explode when the reports arrived. That came later. At first he read. The documents placed on his desk in late September were not dramatic. They did not shout, they did not accuse, they were columns of numbers, operational summaries, fuel allocations, casualty figures. On their own, each report was unremarkable. Together, they formed a picture that could not be ignored. Churchill had lived through enough disasters to recognize one when he saw it. Gallipoli had taught him that lesson decades earlier. What troubled him now was not simply that Market Garden had failed, but that it had failed expensively, publicly, and at the exact moment another Allied army had demonstrated what success looked like. He asked for clarification before he asked for explanation. Fuel reports arrived first. They confirmed what Patton had been complaining about for weeks. Montgomery's 21st Army Group had received absolute priority throughout the operation. Convoys had been rerouted. Other sectors had been delayed. Every available gallon had been pushed north. Patton's Third Army had received half that amount. Churchill read the figures twice, then a third time. X came casualty list. An elite airborne division reduced to fragments in the south. Casualties were a fraction of that number, despite continuous offensive action against organized German resistance. Finally, prisoner counts. The numbers from Patton's sector were staggering. Tens of thousands of German soldiers captured in a matter of days, units removed from the order of battle entirely, not disrupted, not delayed. Churchill set the papers down and stared at the map. For years he had understood war as a balance between courage, resources, and leadership. He had always believed that if Britain and its allies could concentrate enough power at the right point, victory would follow. Market Garden had been built on that belief. Montgomery had promised that concentration would compensate for risk. Now the evidence suggested the opposite. Concentration had magnified fatal not because it made him angry, but because it undermined a decision he had personally endorsed. Market Garden was not merely Montgomery's plan. It was Churchill's gamble. He had believed in it, and now it lay in ruins. Churchill requested a direct call with Eisenhower. The conversation was formal, restrained, and tense beneath the surface. Eisenhower explained the reasoning behind Market Garden as he had before: intelligence assessments, strategic opportunity, the desire to end the war quickly. Churchill listened without interrupting. Why, he wanted to know, had one general been given everything and produced nothing, while another had been constrained and produced results that could not be dismissed? Eisenhower did not have a satisfying answer. He spoke of coalition politics, of the need to maintain Allied unity, of Montgomery's importance to British morale, of Patton's volatility, and the risks of giving him too much freedom. Churchill understood all of that. He had spent his life navigating politics more treacherous than any battlefield. But politics did not change numbers, and numbers were now dictating a different conclusion. What troubled Churchill most was not Montgomery's failure in isolation. Rather than adapting, he demanded more fuel, more priority, more resources. To try again, the same method, reinforced by greater indulgence. Churchill had heard this argument before. He had made it himself in other wars, in other moments when the cost of backing down felt greater than the cost of pressing forward. To resolve the matter, Churchill decided to see for himself. Within days, he traveled to the continent, first to Montgomery's sector, then to Patton's. The contrast was immediate. In the north, the remnants of Market Garden were still visible. Destroyed gliders lay scattered across fields. Burned vehicles marked the narrow highway where armored columns had stalled. Temporary graves dotted the landscape, silent testimony to a promise that had not been kept. Montgomery greeted Churchill with confidence, but it was a confidence strained by events. He spoke of intelligence failures, of weather, of unexpected German strength of success. Churchill listened, then he asked about Arnhem. Montgomery deflected. He spoke of bravery, of sacrifice, of how airborne troops had exceeded expectations. Churchill did not disagree. He simply pointed out that bravery without relief had still ended in annihilation. They drove along the corridor. Churchill said little. He did not need to. The next day he visited Patton's sector. There were no destroyed gliders, no stalled columns, no sense of arrested motion. Units were moving. Engineers were repairing bridges. Civilians were returning to towns that had been liberated days earlier. The war there felt alive, fluid, unfinished. 12 cities taken, rivers crossed, prisoners moved west in columns so large they required constant escort. Casualty figures marked in red, lower than anyone expected. Given the pace of advance, when Churchill asked Patton about fuel shortage, Patton did not complain. He explained how he had worked around them, shorter supply lines, relentless pressure that prevented the Germans from stabilizing their defenses. It was not humility, it was matter of fact. That night Churchill reviewed the reports again. The question was no longer theoretical. It was personal. Had he trusted the wrong man? Churchill understood Montgomery's strengths. Montgomery planned superbly for battles that unfolded according to expectation. When those expectations collapsed, so did his effectiveness. Patton, by contrast, thrived in uncertainty. Where Montgomery sought control, Patton exploited chaos. The war, Churchill realized, had entered a phase where chaos favored the aggressor. In meetings with Eisenhower and senior Allied commanders, Churchill did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He compared calmly, methodically, point by point, fuel versus results, casualties versus gains, promises versus outcomes. The room understood the implications immediately. It was a challenge to the strategy that had protected him. Removing Montgomery outright would fracture British politics and strain Allied unity. Churchill knew that. Eisenhower knew it. Everyone in the room knew it. But protecting Montgomery from consequence was no longer an option. The solution was compromise, but a decisive one. The single-thrust strategy advocated would be abandoned. Resource would be redistributed. Patton's Third Army would be reinforced, not because of favoritism, but because it had demonstrated what it could do under constraint. Churchill did not frame this as punishment. He framed it as necessity. Wars, he reminded the room, they were won by results when the meetings ended. Nothing had changed on paper. No public statements were issued. No commanders were relieved. Yet everyone present understood that the balance of power inside Allied command had shifted. Montgomery had lost the faith that mattered most. Patton had earned it without asking. Churchill returned to London carrying a burden heavier than any report. He would have to explain Market Garden to Parliament, to grieving families, to a nation that had trusted him to choose wisely. He chose his words carefully. Publicly, he praised courage. Privately, he recorded a harsher truth. The war had not been slowed by German resistance. It had been slowed by misplaced trust, and that trust would not be misplaced again. The change did not arrive with a declaration. There was no announcement, no speech, no dramatic reshuffling of command. On paper, Allied leadership looked exactly the same. In reality, everything had changed. The first sign was logistical. Fuel allocation began to shift quietly. The convoys that had once flowed almost exclusively north were redirected. Montgomery's requests were reviewed instead of approved automatically. Patton's Third Army, long accustomed to operating on the margins, suddenly found its pipeline expanding. The effect was immediate. For weeks, Patton had been advancing despite shortages. Now advance accelerated. What had already been dangerous for German defenders became catastrophic. Units that had been barely holding together collapsed entirely. Towns that might have resisted for days fell in hours. This was not a new style of warfare. It was the same method Patton had been using all along. Now unchained German commanders felt the difference first. Intelligence reports from the Western Front began to describe a loss of coherence. Defensive lines dissolved faster than replacements could arrive. Attempts to establish stalmap positions failed because Patton's forces reached them before orders could be implemented. The war was slipping out of German control. Meanwhile, in the north, Montgomery's army adjusted to its new reality. He was reassigned to tasks that suited his temperament, clearing the Scheldt estuary, securing supply routes, opening the port of Antwerp. The work was essential. It was also unglamorous. Montgomery performed it competently, even effectively. But the spotlight had moved from October onward. The narrative of the war shifted south. Maps in Allied headquarters showed Third Army punching deeper into German territory. The Saar region loomed ahead. The Siegfried Line, once presented as a formidable barrier, was now threatened from multiple directions. This redistribution of effort reflected a deeper change in Allied thinking. The failure of Market Garden had killed the illusion that the war could be ended by a single, perfectly executed blow. The new approach was broader, messier, and more relentless. Pressure everywhere, no pauses to reset, no waiting for ideal conditions. It was a strategy born not from theory but from experience. He did not wait for permission to exploit success. He created success and forced the system to catch up. Now the system was finally moving in his direction. Churchill followed these developments closely. He did not intervene publicly. He did not need to. His influence had already done its work. The commanders now receiving priority were the ones delivering results. The change validated his judgment, without requiring him to defend it. Privately, Churchill understood the significance of what had happened. Market Garden had not merely failed as an operation. It had exposed a flaw in Allied command culture, the tendency to reward caution over aggression, to protect reputations rather than measure outcomes. Correcting that flaw did not require humiliation. It required rebalancing. By November 1944, the results of that rebalancing were undeniable. Third Army had advanced another 40 miles. Prisoner counts climbed steadily. Allied momentum, briefly stalled in September, surged forward again with renewed force. Then came the moment that would erase any lingering doubts. In December, the Germans launched their final major offensive in the West. The Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's gamble relied on surprise, speed, and the assumption that Allied command would respond slowly. For a brief moment, it seemed he might be right. Supply lines were cut. Panic spread through rear areas. Eisenhower called an emergency meeting. The question was simple: who could respond fast enough? Montgomery, now commanding forces to the north, offered a familiar answer. He would need time, weeks perhaps, proper preparation, consolidation. He said he could attack in 48 hours. The room fell silent. Turning an entire army 90 degrees in the middle of winter on icy roads against a sudden German offensive was not just risky. It bordered on impossible. Eisenhower asked if Patton was serious. Patton was already issuing orders. Divisions moved through snow and ice. Supply lines were rerouted on the fly. Units that had been driving east turned and drove north without hesitation. In 72 hours, Patton's forces reached Bastogne. The siege was broken. The German offensive collapsed soon after. Montgomery's counteroffensive began weeks later. As planned by then, the crisis had already passed. For Churchill, the lesson could not have been clearer. The decision he had made after Market Garden had not just improved Allied momentum. It had preserved it at the moment it mattered most. If Patton had still been constrained by September's priorities, the outcome at Bastogne might have been very different. This was the final proof. Not that Montgomery was incompetent, not that Patton was flawless, but that in a war defined by speed, uncertainty, and collapse, adaptability mattered more than perfection. By early 1945, the pattern was set. Patton drove deep into Germany, advancing so quickly that Eisenhower eventually ordered him to stop at the borders of Czechoslovakia. Montgomery advanced more cautiously in the north, fulfilling essential but secondary roles. The Allied front moved forward everywhere relentlessly. The war ended in May when Churchill reviewed the final maps. The contrast was unmistakable. Third Army had traveled hundreds of miles from Normandy, liberated dozens of cities, and captured hundreds of thousands of prisoners. Montgomery's forces had advanced methodically, securely, and without further catastrophe. Both had contributed. Only one had defined the tempo. Churchill never publicly humiliated Montgomery. He was too skilled a politician for that. In Parliament, he spoke of courage, sacrifice, and the complexity of command. Wars, he wrote, are not won by men who demand perfect conditions. They are won by men who exploit imperfect ones. Market Garden had taught him that lesson at terrible cost. Patton had confirmed it. The shift Churchill authorized after September 1944 did not just change who received fuel. From that point on, results mattered more than reputation, and that change carried the Allies across the Rhine into Germany and to final victory. When the war finally ended in May 1945, there was no ceremony to mark the moment Churchill changed his mind. There was no document signed, no speech delivered, no line in the history books that recorded the exact hour when faith gave way to evidence. Like most decisive moments in leadership, it passed quietly, buried beneath reports, meetings, and choices made without explanation. But its consequences were written across Europe. By the time Germany surrendered, Allied armies had advanced hundreds of miles beyond the point where Market Garden had promised to end the war. The Rhine was crossed not by a single dramatic leap, but by sustained pressure along a broad front. German resistance collapsed not because of one perfect operation, but because it was never allowed to recover. That outcome carried a bitter irony. The war did end, just not the way Montgomery had promised, not by Christmas 1944, and not by a single bold gamble executed under ideal conditions. It ended because Allied command finally aligned resources with results rather than reputation. For Montgomery, the aftermath was ambiguous. He retained his command, he cleared the Scheldt, opened Antwerp, and performed the kind of methodical, essential work he was well suited for. History would remember him as competent, cautious, and capable within limits. He was never publicly disgraced, and Churchill ensured that he never would be. But Montgomery never again held the center of Allied strategy. The faith that had once surrounded him was gone. For Patton, the aftermath was equally complicated. He did not receive the kind of political reward his battlefield performance might have earned. His temperament remained a liability. His mouth got him into trouble as often as his instincts won battles. He would die in a car accident months after the war before he could shape his own legacy. But within Allied command, his value was no longer in doubt. When speed was required, Patton was trusted. When chaos erupted, Patton was unleashed. His advance across southern Germany became one of the defining campaigns of the final months of the war. Not because it was clean or elegant, but because it worked. In public, he spoke carefully. He praised courage, unity, and sacrifice. He avoided naming failures. He avoided naming favorites. Britain had lost too much to indulge in internal blame. In private, he was sharper. His diaries and correspondence reveal a man haunted not by defeat, but by misjudgment. The realization that 10,000 men had died not because the enemy was unbeatable, but because leadership had clung to a comforting belief for too long. That was the true cost of Market Garden. Not the failed bridge, not the stalled advance, but the proof that confidence, when mistaken for competence, becomes lethal. Churchill never denied his own role in that failure. He understood that leadership does not end at delegation. Choosing who to trust is itself a decision, and decisions carry consequences whether they are acknowledged or not. The lesson he took from September 1944 stayed with him. It shaped how resources were allocated, how commanders were judged, and how quickly patience ran out when results failed to appear. That lesson remains uncomfortable even today, because it challenges a deeply held belief, the belief that good intentions, careful planning, and impressive credentials are enough, that if someone has earned trust in the past, they deserve it indefinitely. War exposes the danger of that belief faster than any other human endeavor. It strips away excuses. It reduces success and failure to outcomes measured in miles, cities, and lives. It does not care how well a plan was written, only whether it survives contact with reality. Patton believed war could only be mastered through motion. Both men were sincere, both were brave, only one approach matched the moment. Churchill did not choose Patton because he admired him. He chose him because the numbers left no alternative. That distinction matters. Leadership is not about loyalty to individuals. It is about loyalty to outcomes. When those two conflict, history shows little mercy to leaders who hesitate. The paradox Churchill confronted in September 1944 is not unique to war. It appears wherever power, resources, and trust intersect, in governments, in institutions, in moments when failure is explained away instead of confronted. It was a tragedy because it revealed the cost of believing too long in the wrong man, while ignoring the evidence produced by the right one. Patton did not win the war alone. Montgomery did not lose it alone, but the contrast between them forced a reckoning that shaped the final victory. Churchill understood that reckoning with brutal clarity, and once he did, the war moved forward again. If this story changed how you see leadership in war, make sure you're subscribed. Leave a comment and tell us who you think was the better commander, Patton or Montgomery, and where you're watching from. These stories only matter if we keep questioning the decisions behind them.